Yeah, so using pornography, being stuck in sexual addiction creates a lot of unhealthy pathways in our brain, takes us down roads that become harder and harder to resist if we continue to go that way. And so we see that impact in the brain. But let's look at another aspect of this as well, that when we're stuck in patterns of using pornography, when we're stuck in patterns of lust and acting out sexually, not with our partner, it's also impacting just our views of sex, views of the body, views of relationships. So let's talk about that a little bit, Heather. How does pornography and sexual addiction shape our views just about what is sexuality or what we might think is healthy sexuality?
Yeah. So, and this is a great question because I think that at a really deep level, it kind of convinces our brain, we convince our brain that this is normal, that everything that we see in pornography, because people tend to gravitate toward the same types of pornography, but that this is normal. This is what is normal in relationship. This is that women like this. Women like to be treated this way. I think that it also tells our brain that this is an expectation, that if I want sex, like using your example, Nick, that if I feel this way and I want sex, then I now have created this expectation that really does put a lot of stress on the partner, for sure. And especially because pornography isn't real, right? What you're watching isn't real. It isn't the way that relationships work, and it's not the way that people respond and react and interact in relationship, or even in a healthy relationship. You know what I mean? And so I think that it really does set yourself up and set your brain up to respond in a way that is based on false expectations. And it also creates those chemicals. So you were talking about those chemicals that are unique to bonding. It also creates those chemicals because your brain is only going to do what it's supposed to do, right? It doesn't know that you're looking at pornography instead of having sex with your wife, and so, or your spouse. And so it's going to do what it's supposed to do. It's going to still create those chemicals, and then your brain is going to bond to whatever it's looking at, right? And so, and this becomes really problematic, I think, and creates a really strong inner conflict in people because their brain is bonding to something almost to a point where they can't have sex with their spouse anymore because their brain won't do it. It's like, this isn't right. This isn't familiar. This isn't what we've been doing. And so I don't know what this looks like.
We're seeing unprecedented levels of erectile dysfunction at all ages of men.
Yeah,
I think a few other things I wrote down is I think it prioritizes an orgasm, that you're chasing that as if that is what sex is about. Which I don't think that is. I think it's mutually like pleasure for both spouses, but like if you don't orgasm, it doesn't mean you didn't have sex. And I think I'm speaking more specifically to men because I think that's what it teaches men, to chase orgasm. Also, your point of emphasis on the man and his pleasure, that's what pornography teaches us. And so it's not about what a woman is, experiencing or the pleasure that she's experiencing inside of that. But then also that emphasis really, and we know this connection, that shows like a devaluing of women on screen when, viewing pornography, which also like it devalues a woman in general. And I think that expectation creates like, well, I can do these things even if they're not comfortable with it. This is what sex is. So this is okay. And I also think the novelty, Nick, that you were talking about, the variety all the time and that expectation that creates for couples. But then another thing too, I think specifically for men and women who are watching pornography, is that if I can't perform in the ways that I'm seeing on screen, that there's shame that I feel. Like these people are lasting for an hour, I can't do that. Or this position is pleasurable for this person, but it's not pleasurable for me when I'm having sex with my spouse. And so there's the shame that creates
there's something wrong with me.
Absolutely.
Wrong with us.
Yeah, and that is awful. That's a terrible, terrible impact.
Yeah, and I mean, on top of that, there's a ton of body comparison that takes place in terms of what are, the size and shape of my body and how athletic or young or whatever am I compared to, those perfected images. And I like that you said, Heather, I mean, it shouldn't need to be said, but I think we need to say it, that pornography is not real. Whether it's images or video, And what we're seeing is an artificial, fake reality. And if we're honest, a very male version of it. It's a personification of what men want, because men are the primary consumers and the primary spenders. And so porn producers have learned what men want and like. And so, of course, they're going to depict a scene where basically anything a man does, the woman finds pleasurable or is acting like they're completely into it too. And so I think that happens in a lot of relationships, is that men in a marriage are expecting the wife, like, how come you don't like that? You're supposed to always be turned on, always be ready. And the feeling that if my spouse is not just what's wrong with me, but maybe there's something wrong with them, that this could be fixed if my spouse was just more fill in the blank. And we maybe haven't even realized where that comes from. Because it's not only pornography, I think it's also just movies. And it's our culture that, honestly depicts, two people that are passionately into it and typically have very fast sex that is mutually enjoyable to both the woman and the man. And yet we know, physically speaking, men and women have very different response rates. That most of a large majority, and Heather can probably give the stats, a majority of women don't reach climax by thrusting alone. There are other pieces of the puzzle that are needed, and it's a slower process. And yet if we watch movies that, the couple rushes into a room or a hotel room, and in a minute they're having sex, and 3 minutes later it's over, we feel like, oh, well, that's real sex. It's like, well, no, actually,
they're both smoking cigarettes and they're drinking a glass of whiskey. It's like, wait, what?
Yeah, it honestly, I think, is intended to be a much slower process. Where the needs of both are considered. And sure, I mean, there can be times, in every marriage, you decide what you enjoy and what's fun. And there may be a time and a place where it's fast and it's, it's passionate like that. But I think there are more realities of just normal sex doesn't look like what's in the movies. And if we can embrace that, we can move towards healthier relationships. And I think the other thing we have to mention, it is the extreme of this, what we're kind of talking about, is the way that today's pornography is more violent and far more violent than it has ever been before. And some of that's because it's the next novel thing that porn producers have figured out is needed for someone to really be turned on. It can't just be normal sex. Now it has to be violent. But the problem with this, and this was done in a study by Anna Bridges and a team of people, that they went and watched the top 50 films from a year of pornography, which obviously we wouldn't recommend, but for research, they did this. And in those 50 films, they found that in a high 80s percentage, the scenes depicted violence against women. And what was more troubling is, of those scenes, over 90% of them, the woman's reaction was either positive or neutral. And so it's training currently, people who watch pornography, training their brain to think violence is not only acceptable, it's good, and my spouse or my partner wants it. And we're hearing a lot of stories about young people that have been trained, honestly, by pornography, think that's normal sex, enter into a relationship with another person who's then horrified by what they're doing to them, or even are turning them into a legal proceedings like, I've been abused. And the other person is thinking, well, what do you mean I abused? I just did what I've seen on film. And it's like, because that's not real. And that's actually very, very dangerous to believe that that's healthy or expected. So from the extremes to violent porn to just the normal of the movies we watch, I think we have to be willing to disengage and say, oh, this isn't real. This isn't how real people act and respond. And I may have to unlearn some things that my brain has adopted.
Right. Well, and I think another thing that happens too is if you can just think for a second, all the things that we just talked about. So you have the behaviors, what you're watching, what your eyes are seeing, what you're feeling. So if you're feeling excitement, but you're also feeling shame and all of these things, your brain is going to store all of that together. Not just the good parts, not just the parts that you enjoyed, but even the feelings you have after that you're going to carry for the next couple of days. Your brain is going to store all of that together because that's just how our brain works. And so I don't think that in the long term, well, even in the short term, that you can ever separate out what your response to pornography and unhealthy or unwanted sexual behaviors from the emotional component that you're left with. I don't think that that's ever possible because that's not how our brain is designed.
I remember when I first heard Dr. Ted teach on that at the Pure Desire University, and then I got to be the one that taught that session about how fear and risk and danger actually amplify adrenaline, and thus amplify pleasure. And so sometimes because people have combined those things, even pain in sex, it's now what they're looking for and not maybe able to see, well, this is actually because of an unhealthy pattern, not really the way my brain and body are intended to work.
Like it gets grafted into our arousal template. That's what gets, like, that is what gives us